Welcome to episode 21, Diva family. I just got back from the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver, where thousands of psychonauts gathered to hear the latest happenings in the world of psychedelics. It was quite a whirlwind week with workshops, conference talks, late night parties, and my favorite part, the gathering of the psychedelic tribe from all over the world. I saw old friends and made new ones. I had the great pleasure of connecting and hanging out with the majority of the women who have been on previous episodes of this podcast. And I met some new friends who will be on future episodes, including today's guest. And I passed out over 1,000 Psychedelic Divas stickers through one-to-one interactions. Perhaps you met me and received one, which is why you're listening right now. And if that's the case, welcome. Thanks for being here and for joining our Psychedelic Divas family. As I mentioned, I met today's guest, Sia Henry, at the conference, where we had the opportunity to sit down and get to know each other a bit. And spoiler alert, I really liked her. And I'm pretty confident you'll feel the same way. So let me read you her formal bio so you could understand what cool work she's doing in the world. Sia Henry is deeply committed to liberation and racial justice and has spent a decade in the criminal legal system reform and abolition spaces. She's a senior policy associate at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, with the goal of ensuring Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color have meaningful access to transformative healing opportunities. She is also the founder and executive director of the Hood Exchange, where she introduces formerly incarcerated Black communities to international travel through the African diaspora. She previously worked with the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice, supporting community-based organizations and criminal legal system partners around the country, and establishing pre-charge restorative justice diversion programs that, without relying on prosecution or incarceration, bring those who have caused and been impacted by harm into healing and accountability processes. She also spent a number of years on conditions of confinement work, engaging in impact litigation, and training to improve conditions for incarcerated people with physical and developmental disabilities and mental health issues and those most at risk of sexualized violence. Sia graduated from Harvard Law School and Duke University. Sia, thank you so much for being a part of Psychedelic Divas.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'd like to start with a little bit of your background story. On your email signature, you have the following quotation: "Be the person you needed when you were younger," by Aisha Siddiqui. I'm curious, what kind of person did you need when you were younger? And how did that need impact who you become?
That's actually a really great question. I haven't thought so much about it. I just really love the quote. I think it's a really beautiful human quote. So growing up, I'm originally from Brooklyn. I have one sister, and my parents had this wacky idea that either of us could be president one day. So they gave us each two-syllable, easy to remember names, and they wanted to make sure that if we were president, that we'd be a well-rounded president. So we did a lot of activities. We went to plays. I was in gymnastics. I was a cheerleader. I was playing piano. We went on different adventures, museums, camping trips. So I had a really beautiful, fulfilling childhood. But I think that I've always had and continue to have this kind of voice in the back of my mind that I'm not good enough, that I'm not doing enough. I don't know exactly where that comes from. And so I think the person that I needed when I was younger was someone who could pick that out of me and see that in me. I mask it a lot. So someone who could pick that out and figure out a way to get through to me, to really not just tell me that I was enough, because it's one thing to say it, but also really get me to feel that way. So yeah, I think that's probably what a lot of us needed both when we were younger and also still need now.
I would say that would be helpful for pretty much everybody.
Yeah.
I love that your parents were like, you could be president, and
We gotta
decided
start you
to.
early. Kind of support you in getting there early.
And do you actually have any interest in that?
No, absolutely not. I think politics are great for people who are great for politics.
All right. Well, I'm going to switch to talking about psychedelics. And
Yeah.
so I've spoken to others in the Black community, and they expressed their early reservations about trying psychedelics. and some expressed it was because their church background was against such use. Others said they feared getting involved with another drug substance that could lead to the kinds of inequitable issues that happen with crack cocaine in the Black community. Tell us about your early psychedelic experiences. What shifted you into psychedelic advocacy with MAPS? And what did your family think of your choices around that?
Yeah, I love this question. So I probably didn't even really fully know about psychedelics until I would say probably my 20s or so. There was always like weed and alcohol and maybe MDMA, maybe, but more so like the street version of ecstasy. But I never really knew about psychedelics, and I started hearing about them, I think mostly about mushrooms. And actually, I wanted to try them for a number of years, but most of my friends, and I have a number of friends who sell drugs, to make a living, but most of them are Black. And so for a number of years, I was asking around, trying to find people who had access to mushrooms specifically, and none of them did. And I was kind of constantly being given this look and getting this reaction of like, what are you doing? We're Black, we smoke weed and we drink alcohol, and that's pretty much it. So thankfully that has definitely evolved over the last number of years. And in 2020, I had a friend who kind of just gifted me mushrooms really beautifully. And so December 2020, I'm home in my apartment with my
We're,
dog, and
we're all home in December 2020.
we're all home. We're all home. True. We are all home. So I decided to try mushrooms. I think I did about 2.5 grams and had the absolute most beautiful experience. I, at one point, left myself a voice message that I still have on my phone. It's about 16 minutes long. But I keep saying in that voice message, I keep saying, I want this for everyone. And after that, I was gifting mushrooms to friends, to neighbors. I was just trying my best to introduce mushrooms to especially people in the Black community. And I, to this day, continue to tell people if you're Black in America, you should absolutely try mushrooms at least once. And my
So can
parents,
you
oh, sorry, go
unpack
ahead.
that a little more? So if you're Black in America, you should absolutely try mushrooms. Why mushrooms?
Yeah.
Why specifically if you're Black in America? Like, please explain that a little better.
Yeah. So I say specifically mushrooms just because that's the substance that I have the most experience with in terms of like that with that psychedelic umbrella. I also know a number of people who've done MDMA or who sell MDMA. I've done MDMA, but a lot of the people I know who do or have tried MDMA, it is more kind of like a party outside, have fun type of situation. And so I think it's a little bit harder for people to make that connection between MDMA and healing. Whereas to me, mushrooms are very much an inside, sit with yourself, reflect, retrospective experience. And for a lot of Black people, there's so much trauma. There's, from intergenerational trauma, when you look at epigenetics and the idea that trauma gets passed down through, I forget the specific number, but it's at least 4 generations, and we're only so many generations out from slavery. And even just from that, from Jim Crow, from sharecropping, we're still within the very deep entrenched grips of mass incarceration. So we have so much trauma in this community. I used to do prison and jail conditions of confinement work. I was in maximum security mostly male maximum security prisons for, a while, also volunteering in a really old prison. I also have a number of friends who've been, in and out of the criminal legal system. And the number of stories I've heard of people, I have a cousin who once said, the first time I saw someone get killed, I was 7 years old and I was walking home from school in Brooklyn. And there was a guy walking in front of me and he had headphones on, and someone came up behind him and shot him point blank in the head. And some of his brain splattered on my coat. And it's interesting because what really seemed to have stood out to my cousin was that it was such a small gun. He was like, I didn't know you could kill someone with such a small gun. And the point is that I've lost track of the number of types of stories that we've had in this community. And when you look at especially within the psychedelic field, a lot of the advocacy work is around supporting veterans with PTSD, substance use disorders, suicidality, which is very well placed attention. And yet, research shows that people from low income Black communities, from these historically oppressed and exploited communities, have very similar rates of PTSD, suicidality, substance use disorders, very similar to veterans, but less people are talking about that. And on top of that, we're also less likely to access therapy. We're less likely to to be able to access and have the resources to access mental health support services. And even when we do, we're less likely to access those. And even myself as an attorney with insurance, I just recently started exploring therapy services and ended up actually ghosting my therapist a year or two ago because she wasn't fixing me fast enough. But the point is, to me, mushrooms are something that, yes, you can access them in a regulated setting and have a facilitator, but they're also something that you can do on your own. Once my suggestion is that if you're going to do that, to do your own research, be prepared, set your space in a way that you'll feel comfortable and kind of do your own prep work and internal work. But it is something that we can access for ourselves. And that also kind of goes back to traditional ancestral African ways that we've had relationships with plants for healing. If you're Black, so many of us have, I'm half Caribbean, my family's from Barbados. So many of us, even if your roots are in the Caribbean or from Africa or even just from America, we have roots where, we know our grandparents and our great grandparents when we're sick, is boiling ginger, using lavender essential oils or honey or other natural substances for our healing. So why not add mushrooms or other even just natural substances to that kind of toolkit of healing? And the last thing I will say about why I tend to tell people, if you're Black and American, you need to try this. There's just something so beautiful that just allows you to, even just for that moment in time, to be able to just kind of exhale and let go of all the things that you're carrying as a Black person, the microaggressions, the systemic racism, the interpersonal racism, the internalized oppression, all of those things that we are carrying on a regular basis that lead to us having very real physical, medical, and mental health issues. Being able to, even just for a couple hours, just let that go is such an incredible is an experience that's really hard to verbalize.
Hey, fellow explorers. Thoughtful planning and preparation is the foundation of any successful psychedelic journey. And if something does go wrong, knowing how to navigate that difficult space is essential. That's why I wrote my psychedelic safety guide, including what to do when things go wrong. It's filled with tips and tools for keeping you and your friends as safe as possible. You'll find it at our website, psychedelicdivas.com. Please, go get it, read it, and share it. The more we all know, the safer we can keep each other. So you've touched on it a little bit. Your work is deeply rooted in liberation and racial justice and the criminal legal system. Was there a defining moment when you realized abolition and restorative justice were your calling?
I don't know that there was a defining moment per se. It was kind of like a slow snowball into this space. So when I was in college, I knew that I wanted to do something around psychology, sociology, racial justice. I wasn't quite sure what. Ended up having a class where we had to read parts of the New Jim Crow, which was very eye-opening. And at the same time, I ended up just randomly befriending a number of people throughout North Carolina who were selling drugs. And through those different interactions and the different things I was reading and learning and having my own friends and family who were in and out of the criminal legal system, I went straight through from undergrad at 22, bright-eyed and like, I'm going to get all the Black people out of prison. I'm going to end the war on drugs. It's going to be great. Um, and then within 2 weeks of going to law school, I had a professor who said, there's morality and then there's the law. And that definitely started my kind of like disillusionment with the legal system and with the idea of practicing law and the traditional practice of law. And kind of later on in my career, really came to value the Audre Lorde quote, you'll never dismantle the master's house using the master's tools, paraphrasing. And really coming to see the traditional practice of law and litigation as like very much part of the master's toolbox, in the sense that we will never litigate our way out of racism, homophobia, classism, xenophobia, all the things. And then thankfully, also in law school, I just happened to stumble into a panel where there were three speakers talking about restorative justice. And the more I learned about restorative justice and started engaging in that type of work, there was just this sense of this makes sense. It was a very humanistic way of interacting with people, in terms of thinking about building relationships, centering relationships, thinking about how you support people in repairing relationships when harm occurs. And so it's kind of a combination of learning more about and being in the restorative justice field, and then also really seeing the magic that happens and the transformation that happens when people have access to the resources and the things that they need to thrive. For instance, organizing delegation trips to places like Norway and Finland to tour their prisons and jails, and seeing how, as societies, places like Norway and Finland really support their population. And then really just starting to question the actual need for our system of punishment, and instead other ways that you can support communities and being well, and then responding when harm and conflict occurs. So it's kind of just been this slow process where the more I've learned and the more I've seen, the more I've experienced, the more firmly I can say that I am an abolitionist, and just really being able to feel rooted when I say those things.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate for a moment.
Yes, love it.
I totally get the power and worth of the abolition perspective. We absolutely are failing our young people, especially our young men, by not providing better educational opportunities, safety nets for those who are falling, other programs that could help turn them at a younger age away from destructive choices. But I would argue that there's also a power in prison. So, my husband is a psychologist and he does psychological evaluations on sex offenders for the state of California as part of the sex offender commitment program. And I proofread his evaluations for 15 years. So, I have literally read over 1,000 sex offender evaluations. And most people erroneously believe that most sex offenders will do it again. And that is absolutely not true. But one of the biggest factors in them not recidivating is getting caught and sanctioned on some level, going to jail or prison, having their crime made public is a huge factor in these men.
Yeah.
And it's 99% men who commit these level of offenses. Basically, it's rape or pedophilia that he was doing evaluations on. It's a huge factor in them not committing sex offenses in the future.
Mhm.
So, if that's the case, isn't there some intrinsic value in our prison system, as deeply flawed as it is?
Love that. So, from my perspective, a majority of people who engage in any type of harm, but we're including sexualized violence, abuse, sexual assault, etc., a majority of those people are um, reacting or acting out of harm and trauma that they themselves engaged in. I think about this whole idea of, well, I have so many thoughts swirling around. I'm going to try to keep it streamlined. So I love the idea of this example of, if I told you there's a kid across the street right now, there's a 10-year-old who's being sexually abused. I think that we can all agree that that kid needs and deserves help right now. But so many of those kids don't get the help and support that they need in those moments. So what happens is they grow up, they turn 18, and now all of a sudden they've crossed this very magical line of now all of a sudden they're an adult, even though their brain is even fully formed until 25 or 28 or something. But now all of a sudden they're an adult. And legally in our country, that essentially means that you are fully and solely responsible for your behavior. And that's not discounting personal responsibility. But to me, it really sheds a light on the fact that we let so many young people fall through the cracks, and we don't give them the support they need. We don't give their parents and their communities the support that they need. Then they grow up, and then our knee jerk reaction is to punish them. Fania Davis, Angela Davis's sister, who's been a big person in the restorative justice space, has said once in an interview that we've created a justice system that harms people to show them that harming people is wrong. And that doesn't make any sense. My former mentor in the restorative justice space, Sujata Balika, I'll get to her story in a second, also made a really beautiful point that there's no way that we can send people to. And so when we're incarcerating people, we're actually just relocating that harm, right? It's kind of like similar to when, the Olympics is moving into a city, and all of a sudden the city wants to disappear their homeless people. So they just kind of ship them off to the next city over. That doesn't mean you've addressed your homelessness, you've just relocated it. And very similarly, if you have people who are engaging in sexualized violence and you're relocating that harm to a penal institution where there's very little oversight, there's very little safety, you have a number of people in mental health and developmental disabilities and physical disabilities who are really prime targets for being sexually victimized, you're relocating that harm, you're not actually addressing it. And therefore, you're also causing kind of residual additional harm by relocating the harm so it can happen in more behind closed doors, behind, walls where there's no support and safety. So kind of shifting back to my old mentor, Sujatha Balagh in the restorative justice space. If you're in the restorative justice space, you know who Sujatha Balagh is. So her parents immigrated to America from India, and from the age of, I might get some of these details wrong, but from the age of, let's say, 6 to 16, she's very open about the sexual abuse that she experienced by the hands of her father. And she also is very open about the fact that she never reported it and she never told anyone because she understood that the systems that were in place to supposedly to keep her safe would largely, if she reported it, there was a good chance her parents would be deported. Her and her sister would end up in foster care and likely separated. And that would actually be more damaging, not just to her, but also to her family. And also, she speaks about how she loved her father and she just wanted him to stop. And so I say all of that because I think that there is this growth in our society of cancel culture where people do things that are harmful, things that we don't like, things that we're afraid of. And we have this knee-jerk reaction of canceling people, of saying, oh, R. Kelly, we're not going to listen to his music anymore. Oh, this person, they're, exiled from our community. They need to be incarcerated. They need to be held accountable. And accountability is a different thing we can talk about. So I told you my thoughts were swirling around. I'm trying to keep it all together. Basically, long story short, my point is that when you're removing people and you're sending people away, that actually causes more harm than it solves. The idea of being caught and that lowering recidivism rates, I struggle with the idea of recidivism rates as being this kind of main metric of success of a thing because it's not addressing like the broader societal responsibility to actually address the harm. And there's also this reality that when let's say I'm out in the community engaging in sexualized violence, and I know that someone else is as well, and that other person ends up getting caught and they get incarcerated. What does that tell me? That tells me to keep doing what I'm doing, but more discreetly, be more careful. Maybe move to a different community. Let's say I'm exiled from the therapist community. Maybe I then just move to a different state. I move to a different city and I continue engaging in that harm. So we have to actually address the underlying issues and the underlying harm, and especially when that's intergenerational trauma. There's a documentary, I believe it's called Hollow Waters, that's about an Indigenous community in Canada that was experiencing rampant sexualized violence and abuse. And especially, which is very similar to a lot of Indigenous communities in the US, and especially when you think about the history of the US and Canadian governments taking Indigenous children and putting them in boarding schools and the sexual abuse that they experience themselves. It's not a surprise that they're then acting out of that same trauma and replicating that same trauma in their community. So there's this documentary called Hollow Waters about this Indigenous community and how they chose to use essentially a form of restorative justice to address the sexual abuse that was happening in their community, as opposed to just completely exiling or removing or incarcerating those people. I don't remember the entire process, but there was a little bit of a part of kind of removing people, but not entirely. It's kind of like you have to live over here for a little bit while we work on repairing that harm and having accountability processes. Um, and one of the one of the big pieces of restorative justice is actually doing a ton of prep work with the person who's caused harm and the person harmed. And then when both sides are ready, actually bringing them together to have a conversation with their loved ones present. And that actually gives an opportunity for the person responsible for the harm to look the person they harmed in the eyes, apologize, hear from the person that they harmed about how that harm impacted them, also hear from their, each side's respective loved ones. And then at the end of that process, everyone involved in that process, everyone in the room then comes up with a plan to support the responsible person in making things right to the person they harmed, their family, their community, and then also themselves. And it's a process that is being used. It's kind of growing in a number of communities in the United States, in Brooklyn, in DC, in LA, and in Alameda County, and in Oakland. And the processes being used in the US are largely modeled off of the process being used in New Zealand. In New Zealand, they call it family group conferencing. It's actually the country's default approach to responding to juvenile harm. And the point of bringing that all up is that it has about a 98% victim satisfaction rate or survivor satisfaction rate, and significantly lower recidivism rates, around 10 to 13%, depending on who you ask. So that's a way of keeping people in their communities, not removing people from their families and communities, actually centering the needs of the person harmed, while also significantly lowering recidivism rates for offense. And this is also a process that is more effective when used for serious harms, sexual assault, carjacking, assault, burglary, even up to murder. It's the more serious the harm, the more effective it is at lowering recidivism rates.
Well, I would certainly say that this sort of a process would be far superior to our current sex offender registration and wearing of bracelets. One of the side effects of doing that work with my husband is that I actually have huge compassion for sex offenders as a result of
Mm.
reading all those evaluations, which those evaluations included their backstory, basically, what happened to them. And I am deeply grateful that my compassion and empathy muscles got stretched as a result of being able to hold the bigger perspective around those crimes. And yes, some of those crimes were truly heinous. But in this country, we treat sex offenders as the lowest of the low in our society, lower than
Mhm.
murderers. In when you are on parole for with a sex offense, you have to wear a bracelet, and you're released to the county where your crime was committed. So in San Francisco is both a city and a county. And the sex offender laws are that you can't live within a certain distance of a park or a school. And in San Francisco, there is literally no place that is not within those boundaries.
Yeah.
So here is your situation where you are wearing a bracelet that you need to charge twice a day, and you cannot find a place to live that is within the safe boundary that has been prescribed by California state law. So many of them end up living under the freeways. And then when they can't keep their bracelets charged, then they are just automatically returned to
Hmm.
prison for that failure, and that's
Yeah.
considered a ding on whether they're likely to recidivate or not. Instead of a compassionate story of we are not providing just even the most basic resources of an electric plug for people who we are mandating do these things. So yes, I would say that what you just described actually does the same thing because it's the surfacing of the crime. It's the surfacing of what happened that leads them not to recidivate. It's oh, I didn't, people know about this now and I have shame. And I'm not going to do that again. And also, the community is aware now, not on the level where you have to look on a registry, but your family. And so
Yeah.
that's what you're talking about is like bringing that awareness, and that's really what it is that was leading to those lower recidivism rates.
Yeah. And I'll also just add a big piece that I feel like I kind of glossed over in my original explanation. A big part about the process, the restorative justice process I just described, is about specifically centering the needs of the person harmed. So if you look at our criminal legal system from the outset, the second you're arrested, you're told everything you say can and will be used against you. So from the beginning, and then you're assigned an attorney who tells you not to speak, and maybe you're not even called to testify. So from the beginning of that process, you're essentially told to not tell the truth, to not tell the truth that this will be used against you. And part of that silence, or even worse, that denial, that actually causes more harm to the person who survived that harm to have to then show up to court and hear you, either watch you not say anything or hear you sit on a stand and deny having engaged in the harm that you engaged in. And even a criminal legal system, if you look at the names of cases, it's always US v. Henry, right? The Henry being the person who caused the harm, US being the state or the county or the country, depending on where the case is being brought. The survivor or the victim is just a witness. We don't actually need you to show up. You don't even need you to cooperate. You're just a witness in this process to help the state punish this person who's committed a crime against the state. And so restorative justice completely shifts that focus, where the entire focus is on the needs of the person harmed, down to, even once you even how we're setting up the room to come into the space with the person who's harmed you. Where do you want to sit? Who do you want to be in the room first? Do you want to speak first? If you speak first and you first open up by sharing what happened to you, you get to set the narrative, control that narrative. And then even thinking about the reparative plan, the different things that the responsible person is going to have to complete in order to make things as right as possible, that reparative plan is also very much centering you. So it's also very healing for the person harmed.
Well, it does sound like a beautiful process. I'm in total agreement with that. And I've often thought that the when someone is civilly committed because they have been found by two psychologists to be likely to reoffend in the sex offender commitment program, then they don't get out of they've done their prison time, but they're now sent down in California to our Department of State hospitals, which is in Coalinga,
Mm-hmm.
California, and
Mm-hmm.
they stay there. They can do the sex offender commitment program and work through the levels to try to leave, or they can not participate in any of that. But we are locking them up, and they are. There's a lot of PTSD in that community. I often thought that they would be actually a really wonderful resource to do some of the psychedelic clinical trials because
Mm-hmm.
it's such a constricted environment. And I thought it would be, it's not something that we're going to spend money on, but I thought it would be a really beautiful community to try to bring that work into to see if that could shift any of their healing process.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
definitely.
anyway,
I when I used to work at the prison law office, which is based in Berkeley, they're the leading nonprofit law firm doing prison jail conditions of confinement work in the country. They're the ones who brought the Plata v. Brown lawsuit, probably I think in the early 2000s. All these lawsuits are still going on, which is wild, around representing all incarcerated people in California state prisons with serious medical issues. I think when they brought the lawsuit, it was something like at least one person was dying every 7 days for preventable medical failures and issues within the California Department of Corrections. Anyway, so in working at that law firm and doing a lot of audits of pretty much most of the prisons in California for various lawsuits, one of them being Coleman, which is representing all incarcerated people with mental health issues. I spent a little bit of time in the Department of, I forget, DHS, the Department of Health Services or whatever it stands for, which there's one in Stockton, which is actually, it's within the prison in Stockton. It's pretty visibly, structurally no different from the prison that it's located in. It's just supposedly being ran by DHS. And one of the things that I am working on at MAPS and that I'm really passionate about is looking at the possibility of psychedelic assisted healing for people directly impacted by the criminal legal system. And there's this whole debate or this whole, conversation about, what if we had psychedelic assisted therapy in prisons and jails? From my experience, having spent a ton of time in prisons and especially looking at the different medical and specifically the mental health systems in prisons, think that is actually wildly dangerous and inappropriate and really makes me nervous when I was working in the prison law office and doing audits there. So because of the Coleman lawsuit, California can now no longer put people with serious mental health issues in solitary confinement or the SHU, SHU. And so the solution then was to create a PSU, which is I forget what all these, there were so many acronyms at this job. It stands for something. It's essentially solitary confinement or the SHU for people with serious mental health issues. Same thing structurally, it's just called something and it's a different housing unit. And there's certain things that the correctional officers are supposed to do. There's all these different protocols. If someone mentions being suicidal, there's a certain protocol you're supposed to follow, which involves one of the things you're supposed to do is move them to the medical unit. And you put them in a cell that has nothing, no beds, no clothes. They're completely naked. There's a hole in the ground, there's a toilet. And then you have a clinician just sitting in front of the cell watching you, because that's supposed to be, I guess, the response to people feeling suicidal. I guess it's supposed to somehow make you feel less suicidal. But even then, a lot of the stories I was hearing from people was that they would report to correctional officers that they were feeling suicidal or that they had just swallowed a bunch of razor blades to kill themselves, and the correctional officers would tell them, "Go ahead and kill yourself," or would put them in. A lot of the prisons have these like little human cages, kind of like the British phone booth size things, but they're cages, and they would put them in there and like throw things at them. The mental health housing units also have rooms for group therapy, which essentially have like five of the human cages that they would put each person in their little human cage, and then like put the television on. That was supposed to be part of the group therapy. You're having a one-on-one session with your therapist, with your clinician. Sometimes a correctional officer would insist in being in the room, or even if it is a private conversation, you later hear the correctional officer in your housing unit repeating things that you told your clinician in a private conversation. For so many, and we're not even getting into all the violence and neglect and all the things. For so many things, for so many reasons, I just think it is I am very concerned by the idea of giving incarcerated people psychedelics. I think that there's a possibility of doing that post incarceration, supporting formerly incarcerated people. But really, my dream and goal would be that, again, if we understand that people oftentimes engage in harm because they're acting out of their own experiences with trauma, why not offer them healing opportunities, one of which can be like one of the voluntary things on the menu being psychedelic assisted healing as an alternative to incarceration, as part of some like broader diversion program, as opposed to further incarcerating people with the hell that is incarceration. And then afterwards or during, being like, would you like some MDMA or whatever the substance is? I think that makes a lot more sense than just continuing to engage in the current cycle of punishment that we have, that we know is deeply, deeply, deeply. I was traumatized myself just by being in these spaces, and I was able to go home at the end of the day. So just by being able to, so my dream and goal would be having that be part of an alternative to incarceration process.
I think from your description that I would agree with that. So, 2 years ago, you spoke on psychedelic social equity and criminal justice at Psychedelic Science 2023. Can you tell us a bit about what you shared in that talk and also let us know what might have changed in the past 2 years around this topic?
Years ago, so it feels like it was so long ago. I believe that talk. I think I was moderating a panel. I also moderated a panel last week at Psychedelic Science. Both of them looking at criminal legal system reform issues and that overlap between psychedelics and drug policy reform. I believe some of those topics were around decriminalization, so the need to decriminalize this thing that a lot of organizations, companies are starting to profit off of, similar to with cannabis, but also now with psychedelics and with regulated access. So decriminalizing the possession of not just psychedelics but drugs generally, um, and also the importance of retroactive application of those laws. So we have, so many people still serving really long sentences. I currently have a friend serving a life sentence in a federal prison for all nonviolent drug related offenses. So making sure that as our laws finally begin to catch up with logic and reality and sociology and science and research and all the things, as those laws begin to catch up, we also need to make sure that where I don't think you can really correct or address or repair the harm of taking people's years of people's lives away, but begin to address that by making sure that those laws are being applied retroactively. Um, Also talking about, the importance of record clearance, so both being convicted of a crime, but even just being arrested for something and not even actually being convicted goes on your record. And different states, and including the federal government, have different ways of handling those records, and also different processes for a person being able to clear or to remove certain things from their records. There's different processes. A lot of those processes, the majority of time, require the person with the record to actually pay money and then also navigate that process in order to get different things removed or sealed or expunged on their record. And so also thinking about the importance of having those processes be done automatically. A lot of states that I've spoken to, a lot of state representatives have claimed that that would be too expensive to have those processes applied retroactively. I've always questioned expensiveness of being able to do that, and also thinking about the residual or kind of indirect consequences of not having that be done, and all the different things you're no longer able to access to. You were mentioning earlier, people being on the sex offender registry and not being able to find housing, and then adding on top of that, not being able to live with certain family members or loved ones because they are in government assisted housing and they can't have anyone living there with a criminal record, not being able to get food stamps. There's some, I think it's 2,000 plus collateral consequences, or what they call it, of having a criminal conviction, having a record, all the different things that prevent you from being able to kind of turn your life around or kind of avoid returning to a lifestyle that,
Or
is
there's a
trying to
younger
come.
sibling in the house and they're not allowed to be around
Exactly.
children. And so even though they might have been a rapist and have no interest in children, they're still not allowed to return to the family to live. So,
Exactly. Exactly. And then the last piece that I always bring up whenever I'm asked to talk about things is, there's this kind of slow, kind of creeping move towards decriminalizing possession of various substances, and also decriminalizing, especially with psychedelics, the manufacturing. But very few people are talking about sales. And there's this idea of, oh, just decriminalize the possession, and we can continue incarcerating the people who are engaging in sales. And I'm not just talking about like the children who are selling weed to their friends, but the people who are kind of in a more organized way or a more wholesale way engaging in sales. And I think that's a big mistake. Those are the offenses that are really continuing to contribute to mass incarceration in addition to violent offenses. And
and it doesn't, it's like this empty hole in the whole system. It's like,
mhm,
oh,
mhm.
it's okay to possess, but where did you get it from? It
Exactly,
didn't just
exactly.
manifest out of thin air.
Exactly. I was just going to say that. And also recognizing the economic realities and reasons that drive a lot of people to engage in drug sales. So again, it comes back to this holistic need to address the underlying reasons why people are doing things, as opposed to just keeping certain things illegal or having this knee jerk reaction of, but we still need to incarcerate and punish people. But it's like, but do we, if we could just give people access or increase people's access to lucrative employment?
So, how do you work to ensure racial equity is embedded throughout MAPS research and advocacy?
So, still a uphill battle, and that is really one of the reasons why I'm in this space. Everything I do is for the healing and wellness and liberation of the Black community. And everything I do, and every meeting I'm in the back of my mind, there's always this question of like, so what does this mean for the Black community? And so part of it for me is, when we're talking about public education campaigns or trainings, making sure that there's language and information out there that is culturally appropriate, culturally accessible, not just to the Black community, but also other communities. As I mentioned before, I'm leading some work in our policy and advocacy department, looking at the possibility of psychedelic assisted healing for, we're calling them system impacted people, or essentially people directly impacted by a criminal legal system. So we finished two literature reviews that we're in the process of getting published. One is looking at the mental health needs of system impacted people, both before and during and after incarceration. And then the other literature review is looking at the possibility of psychedelics for that population, really more so focusing on the different possible legal barriers. Um, and then we're in the process of raising money to then move into the second phase of that research, which would be paid focus groups. I always think that these types of focus groups, especially when you're talking to current and formerly incarcerated people, and looking to extract their lived experiences and wisdom, they do need to be paid for that information. So we're looking to do paid focus groups with, we've narrowed it down right now to formerly incarcerated people of color. Again, understanding that people of color, especially Black and Brown communities, Black and Indigenous communities, have very specific needs and lived experiences. Even within those different communities, we are not a monolith. You really need to kind of tease apart the experiences, not just of the Black community, but the Black queer community, the Black, low income community, the Black immigrant community. So all these different communities. So really looking at the different specific needs, and really centering and I got this from my restorative justice work, is really centering the needs of the most historically oppressed and exploited people within those communities, and then working with them and partnering with them and following the direct and meaningful and very real leadership of folks from those communities to then create, different systems and support them and resource them and creating solutions. And so the idea is doing these paid focus groups and then working directly with formerly incarcerated people of color to create a healing modality, to create a psychedelic assisted healing approach that they believe would work for members of their community. So it's not just taking, for instance, MAPS's MDMA assisted therapy model, which is studied and celebrated, and yet was also created by and for white folks. Not just taking that and kind of just plopping it in, a heavily criminalized Black community, but actually working with that Black community to say, what do you need? What would work for you? What would feel comfortable for you? Because even when we say psychedelics, within my community, people are like, oh, that's for white people. Like even among my friends and family, I'm like the person who does drugs, or, someone calls me for a meeting on a Tuesday at 4 p.m. and they're like, are you doing ayahuasca? And I'm like, why would I be doing ayahuasca? It doesn't make any sense. So there's still a lot of education and kind of myth busting and kind of correcting of misinformation that needs to happen in that community. And also, again, going back to what I was saying about not accessing therapy and kind of traditional mental health support services, working with those communities to figure out what would work for them, and then figuring out ways that we can take MAPS's decades of knowledge and resources and experiences and kind of pairing those different things, but again, through the leadership of those formerly incarcerated communities.
All right, so let's dream into the future. It's 20 years from now. What would you like to dream up or envision around psychedelic therapies intersecting with criminal justice reform and restorative justice practices? Like, you get to dream whatever you want.
So to me, it's very important to name that psychedelics are part of this like broader toolbox. And it's not just any issue, just sprinkle some psychedelics and everything will be fine. So to
I
me, that
100% agree with that.
so because I feel like there's kind of that tunnel vision there from some people in this field. So to me, that future looks like, generally speaking, not just the formerly incarcerated community, not just the Black community, but communities generally having access to the resource and things that they need to be well, having access to quality medical care, quality, respectful, culturally appropriate, trauma informed medical care, mental health care, education, housing, employment, healthy foods, healthy drinking water, healthy air, all those things, starting there. And then when we talk about harm occurring, because just naturally as human beings, harm occurs, conflict occurs, sometimes that conflict turns into harm. There's a difference between those two things. Harm occurs, having restorative justice processes to address the harm. And in that process, figuring out the different underlying reasons why that harm occurred in the first place, and then having different things in place to support that person in addressing that harm. Whether it's a mental health issue, figuring out what types of mental health support that person might be able to benefit from, whether it's traditional talk therapy, whether it's psychedelic assisted therapy, whether it's something else, maybe it's equine therapy. I don't know, like figuring out, having a whole kind of menu of things to not having that one size fit all approach, but having a really kind of customized, tailored healing approach. And then also on the other end, for the person or people harmed, also having that same access to healing opportunities. Yeah.
And I would say for those sitting there saying, yeah, that all sounds great, but how do we pay for it? That the state of California pays $250,000
Mm-hmm.
per individual who are locked up with the civil commitment program, the sex offenders that are down
Yep.
in Coalinga at our locked mental ward. So $250,000 a year per person. If they weren't
Yep.
there, if that money had been spent earlier on the kinds of programs you're describing, we wouldn't be spending it on the back end.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. I'm not an economist. I don't know money things. However, What I very strongly feel is that, as the richest or one of the richest countries in the world, we absolutely have the resources to do all of these things tomorrow. What it really comes down to is the will. It comes down to getting out of, I heard someone once say that we're the most individualistic society. What it comes down to is remembering how interconnected we are, remembering that I might live in this fancy, expensive neighborhood and not care about what's happening in the hood across the city or whatever. But if I don't care, that is impacting me. So when I go to the grocery store, I can't get upset when I get robbed because we as a society, we collectively decided that we didn't care about each other. We could wake up tomorrow and decide that we're going to shift that perspective and actually decide to take care of each other. When I organized the delegation trip to Norway and Finland to tour their prisons and jails, it was 22 of us. It was some formerly incarcerated people, some California state legislators, funders, journalists, an architect, Pulitzer
So,
Prize
so
winning
this is through
author, a
your
bunch of people.
nonprofit, the Hood Exchange.
No.
No, okay. All
This
right.
was in 2019 at Impact Justice. We just had like a hundred
Got it.
thousand dollars, and I was just told to just have at it, plan this trip. And when we were in Finland, and we were meeting with some of the folks from the government and touring their jails. And at one point, they said we have four young people incarcerated in the country. And someone said, they're like, you mean 4%? I guess they thought there was some type of language thing. They're like, oh, like, you mean 4%? They're like, no, four. We literally have four young people in this entire country currently incarcerated. And I think it was some, maybe, I don't remember, a couple thousand, maybe if that, incarcerated. Both Norway and Finland, their average prison sentence is around 8 months.
Hmm.
Even a life sentence is 15 years, if that. And even
Wow.
then, a third of their prisons are open, which means that you sleep there at night, but then everyone has their own individual cell. You're not in there with anyone. You sleep there at night, but then during the day, you get to leave. You get to leave and go to work and go to school and visit your family and friends. And they don't have the recidivism rates that we had. And, even for, again, average of 8%, I mean, 8 months that you're being incarcerated for, if that. We went to dinner with some people from the government one night, and someone had asked one of the Finnish officials about their like poverty or homeless issues or something. And the response was something along the lines of like, we don't have homeless people, or we don't have that issue. And it's just, when you're talking about a country where any woman who gives birth, automatically the government sends you this like care package that's, has like it's like a baby starter pack, right? And has things like kind of essential things you need for a baby. And a lot of babies, that the box that it comes in is like their first crate or crib, or not crate.
Crib.
Oh my God. I have a dog.
We don't
Sorry.
crate. Yeah, we don't
we
crate
don't
children.
crate, we don't crate children. That would be bad. Um, crib. The point is that, and these are countries that are either economically similar to us, or I think Finland is actually less economically well off. And so if they can do it, we can do it. It comes down to the choice.
Absolutely. So I mentioned the Hood Exchange. So tell us about your nonprofit, the Hood Exchange. You founded it to create
Yeah.
opportunities for healing, community building, and growth for formerly incarcerated Black folks through international travel. I'm so curious what inspired that vision, and can you share about the impact of your first trip?
Yeah, absolutely. So was an idea that kind of just came to me one day, 3 or so years ago. So I absolutely love traveling. I go to at least two new countries a year. I've been to 42, 43 countries. And it's just something about being in a completely different society and just kind of seeing what other people are up to, seeing different sights. I love nature. I love the ocean, all the things. And the reality of it is that so many people who look like me have never been out of the country, never been on a plane, never been out of their city, even their neighborhood.
I mean, there's people in the East Bay who have not seen the Pacific Ocean.
Wild to me. It's
It's wild to
absolutely
me.
wild. It's
Yes.
absolutely wild. And so the whole idea with the HUD exchange, I have a friend who I met when he was incarcerated in San Quentin, serving a 56 something to year to life sentence, and ended up having his sentence commuted by the governor. And he's brilliant. He's in the process of writing a book. And he was giving a workshop a couple of years ago talking about this imagination problem that we have. which is basically that, and it's this idea that the project of colonialism essentially baked white supremacy and white supremacist views and mindsets into every single institution, and even like our mindsets, right? From our education system, our medical system, our transportation system. Um, and there's also this idea that if you've never experienced anything else, how can you imagine something else? Because even our imagination is based on things that we have experienced, right? Like we never experienced, like, if you think about a pool filled with Jello, we know what Jello is like, we know what a pool is like, put them together. But if I have no idea what Jello is, or I have no idea what a pool is, I can't really conceptualize that. So this idea is kind of borrowing off of that, and this idea that we have this imagination problem, and especially within these historically oppressed and exploited Black communities where you haven't experienced so many things and so many things that the world has to offer besides just your immediate um, neighborhood and kind of reality, which is often shaped by not just white supremacy, but also violence. And that is not your fault, but violence that's been very deliberately created and kind of put in your neighborhood and in your community. Um, how can you ever really imagine something different for yourself, for your people, for your community? So the idea, long story short, the idea is to create these opportunities to expose folks to other things, and specifically taking people on trips within the African diaspora so that they're able to experience communities filled with other people who look like them, who are just living very differently. So I single-handedly built this organization, the website, got the funding, or the 501c3, was applying for all these grants, getting rejected from all of them. Finally got a grant from the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Nursing through a global learning for health equity program. And so April 2024, took a group of 10 or so people from Atlanta to Ghana for a week. So it was 4 young men in their 20s, and one of them is in his early 30s, who have criminal records or who have otherwise had direct contact with the criminal legal system, or their immediate family members have. And then I also brought a formerly incarcerated mentor, a Black man who did about 15 or so years in Georgia prisons. Also brought a Black therapist. And then it was actually surprisingly very difficult to find people willing to go on this completely free, all expense paid trip. So one person backed out. At one point I was like literally just in bars, like talking to people, like, "Do you want to go to Ghana?" Which probably was weird for them. But my sister is an anthropologist at Harvard, so she ended up coming, and then I also brought a videographer. So we all went. One of the guys, it was his third time ever on an airplane. None of the guys had ever been to Africa or out of the country, and so we spent a week in Ghana. We met with an herbalist and a kind of alternative therapist there, and learned about kind of plant medicine from a Ghanaian perspective. We had a traditional Ghanaian cooking class. One of the guys had never cut an onion before. He didn't know that would make him cry. It was a whole thing. And then we spent a day with a nonprofit that works with current and formerly incarcerated Ghanaians. And so they brought some of their formerly incarcerated constituents and hung out with them for a day. And then we went down the Cape Coast to what they call a slave castle, which castle is a wild thing to call it, but it's one of the structures on the western coast of Africa. They're kind of dotted along Western Africa, where enslaved Africans were held before they were shipped off to the Americas. So that was a really heavy experience. And then we also went to the Inchincha Museum, which is kind of like an open air art gallery and has a whole really beautiful section, kind of in honor of all the enslaved Africans that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And it was, honestly, it was the most beautiful thing I've ever done, most beautiful thing I've ever been a part of. We're actually in the process of making a documentary about it that should be done hopefully within the next couple of months. And we're going to do a screening of it for the community. And what I really thought the impact and the transformation would be, I thought that would come from reconnecting folks to their roots. And that was part of it, but it was kind of more in the background. Interestingly, the more impactful and kind of healing and transformative piece of that was the relationships that we made within the group. Most of the people I'd never met before a week before we left the country. We had a send off dinner, so we very much left as strangers and we came back as family, and those relationships are still continuing. Some of the guys have gone into business with each other, like kind of property management and things like that, and it is so beautiful. One of the guys, I didn't even know this until towards the end of the trip. One of the youngest guy was 24. He had lost his mother within the last couple of years, and we did kind of recorded interviews throughout the way. And the last night, he breaks down at one point in his interview, and he was talking about how he basically like admitted for the first time out loud how he's been struggling with depression and having trouble getting out of bed in the morning and questioning his own worth. And he was like, this trip came right on time, and it's you could even see in the footage like this shift in him and how much more like alive he is now. There's another guy who a couple days before the trip, one of his best friends was arrested, and he I think some of the other people in his friend group were kind of trying to get him to come outside, and he was so afraid of missing out on this opportunity by getting arrested again that he like literally just stayed in his house before we left the country. And in his last night in Ghana interview, he talks about how he wants to be able to have more experiences like this, but he's afraid of, coming back to Atlanta and returning to his community and neighborhood, and afraid of just kind of falling back into those old patterns. And so it's been really beautiful to come back and to really be able to kind of see the relationships that we formed and to be able to continue to support one another. And yeah, so it was just I didn't go into the project planning on making a documentary, but it's like one of those things that's like I can't quite put into words this thing that we've done together. So we'll just show you all because it was really beautiful.
Wow. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah,
Sia, thank you so much. This has just been fascinating and so wide-ranging. I so appreciate your time and your
of
powerful
course.
advocacy work in the world. How can people find out more about you and how can they best support your work?
So people can visit my nonprofit's website at hoodexchange.org. It's just hoodexchange.org. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I haven't been on social media since 2013, which I'm not sorry about, but Sia Henry, SIA Henry on LinkedIn. And you can also reach me at Sia at maps.org for maps, psychedelic related things, and then Sia at hoodexchange.org for hood exchange related things.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of
Of
that. And y'all
course.
support the Hood Exchange so she can take more people. It's
I know.
what a beautiful gift. What a beautiful I really can't
Thank
wait to see
you.
this documentary.
Thank you,
And
Carla. I really appreciate it.
oh, my pleasure. And thank you all for tuning in and for being part of this communal growth journey. Of course, I would so appreciate if you would follow us on Instagram at Psychedelic Divas. But if you really want to support my work, my request is that you go to our website, psychedelicdivas.com, and provide me with your email address. In exchange, I will give you my invaluable safety guide, which includes advice on what to do when things go wrong. But the reason I'm asking for your email is that the social media sites are pulling down psychedelic pages, even when we are offering safety and harm reduction information. So while I definitely want to build my Instagram following, that following could be taken away at any point. So unfortunately, email is really the only secure way to build a following so that you can be sure to stay in touch with my work. And I hope you'll consider doing that today. And of course, I promise to not take advantage of that trust by selling or spamming you in any way. So thank you all again for listening. Thank you again, Sia. And I so look forward to growing together. See y'all next episode.